Since my book that I published in 2013 called Designing to Avoid Disaster, The Nature of Fracture Critical Design, my work has moved in a couple directions. That book was really looking at what I call in the book our Ponzi scheme with the planet, the idea that we have over the last few hundred years developed essentially a Bernard Madoff-like scheme that has really affected our use of resources, our exploitation of populations around the globe in very much the same way that Bernard Madoff's financial Ponzi scheme exploited investors. The idea, for those of you who may not know as much about how Ponzi schemes work, is essentially they're a pyramid scheme that enables those at the top of the pyramid to continue to exploit larger and larger numbers of people, or in the case of our Planetary Ponzi scheme, resources as well as other species. And this works as long as one can continue to expand the base of the pyramid. The problem that Madoff faced, and the problem that we now face with our Planetary Ponzi scheme, is that when you run off the planet, when you quite literally run out of people to exploit or resources or other species, the pyramid scheme becomes very unstable, a bit like a structure that extends over its foundations. It collapses pretty quickly. That happened to Bernard Madoff's scheme. He's now in prison as a result of it. There have been other Ponzi schemes in recent years that have essentially had the same result. They collapse quickly, and people are put in jail for the fraud involved. But a couple lessons from Madoff that I think affects the way in which we need to think about our Planetary Ponzi scheme is that Madoff realized that if the scheme is big enough, two things will happen. One, people will not see it. It's a paradox. The bigger it is, the harder it is to see. And secondly, even if they do see it, they don't want to admit to it because so many people are involved. In the book that I wrote in 2013, I basically made that argument as to the dilemma we now face on the planet, which is that we have been over-consuming resources, we have been fragmenting habitat, and as a result extinguishing species at record rates. We've been borrowing heavily from future generations in our overconsumption of oil, for example. We've been altering our climate and lots of other issues going on as a result of our essentially exploiting these resources. But we are now off the planet. It takes, by some calculations, 1 1/3 to 1 1/2 planets to meet our current need, which means our pyramid scheme has run off its base and has become very unstable. So the future is one, I think, of thinking about what a post-Ponzi scheme existence will be like, a bit like what Madoff's investors had to come to terms with after his financial Ponzi scheme collapsed. And so thinking about that is the topic of my next book, which is coming out in the spring of 2016 from the University of Minnesota Press. And that is called Designing Our Way to a Better World. And essentially what I try to do in that book is define what this post-Ponzi existence would be like. How can we get past a world in which we are exploiting other species, other people, resources, future generations, and think about living within our ecological footprint, living within our means, and how that will change the way we think about our politics, our economics, our educational system, our infrastructure, and a number of other similar systems that we depend on. So I think that this is really the great challenge and also the great opportunity that we have. A lot of my work also derives from a long-term interest in ethics, and so I look at the ethical implications and ethical responsibilities we have in this regard. And I'm hoping that it presents a more optimistic or at least more future-oriented view, because certainly one of the, I think, understandable responses to my last book was that it's pretty depressing thinking about the fact that our entire civilization has been essentially built on a Ponzi scheme, and the idea that it in fact might collapse, and as many Ponzi schemes do, collapse rather suddenly. So my more recent work has been looking at a more constructive, positive future going forward. The work I'm now doing, since the book coming out from the University of Minnesota Press will be out in early 2016, I'm also looking at the nature of cities in this new world that we will all be occupying. Since I published my last book, I went from being the Dean of the College of Design to the Director of the Metropolitan Design Center here at the University of Minnesota, which is a center that looks essentially at urban futures, looking at the ways in which cities are changing and will be changing based on new economic, social, and environmental contexts. So the work I'm currently engaged in is looking at what I think of as sort of the rise of the on-demand city, the rise of a city in a sort of post-Fordist world. And I've been doing a lot of work tracing the rise of the so-called sharing, collaborative, or on-demand economy. And there's quite a growing literature in that area. Not much of it, though, has been looking at what the physical implications of this new economy are. And so my work has been focused on that, looking at what will cities and suburbs and small towns and rural areas as well look like in an era in which we are moving from an economy based on ownership to one based on access. Moving from an economy of mass production and mass consumption to one of mass customization. A lot of post-Fordist thinking has been acknowledging this shift, although I think one thing that I would critique about that discourse is the notion that post-Fordism I view as a kind of transition out of the Fordist mass production economy of the 20th century, but much of it still is assuming that a lot of the corporate structures that we have still will continue. And one of the things that I'm interested in is how the post-Fordist economy, this sharing, collaborative, on-demand economy, will actually suggest another way in which people will be living, working, and making things that isn't necessarily within a kind of corporate structure. A lot of the work that I've been doing has been looking at the ways in which people are less and less living in residential areas, commuting to corporate offices, working 9 to 5 in corporate settings, even having full-time employment in corporations, and moving much more dramatically to a gig economy, an entrepreneurial way of working in which there is much more flexibility in their work lives. So I think we're in this interesting transition, and what I'm trying to do now is to connect these economic shifts and these changes in the ways in which we'll be living and working back to the post-Ponzi scheme world that I talk about in the book coming out in the spring of 2016. So that, in brief, is what I've been working on.
Let's just start with a point of clarification.
Yeah.
It took me The third time you spoke about Postfordist, I realized Henry Ford.
Right. Right.
Okay, but can you say a little bit about Fordism, what we're going beyond here?
Yeah, so I mean the ways in which this is often talked about in economics as well as in cultural theory is that Henry Ford's assembly line process, some will call that the rise of the second industrial revolution. The first industrial revolution, the one we all study in high school, as we know, came from the emergence of the steam engine, the mechanization of work that characterized the 19th century. Fordism arose in the early 20th century with the rise of the assembly line process that Henry Ford helped develop and led to a 20th century economy of mass production and mass consumption, one that dominated much of the 20th century. In the latter part of the 20th century, we began to enter what many call the post-Fordist economy, which is a move away from mass production and mass consumption to a world where there was much more specialized production of goods tailored for niche markets, and the emergence of a more flexible workforce. However, I find in a lot of that conversation still an assumption that large corporations are still central to the economy. And a lot of what I'm interested in looking at is, since I believe that this post-Fordist, late 20th century economy is really a transition to a very different kind of economy, the so-called sharing or collaborative economy, which isn't framed by large corporations. In fact, it has a tendency to undermine the power of large corporations. And so, and again, my work is mainly focused on the physical implications of this. What does it mean when we see a population which is increasingly moving back into cities, moving into settings where people are living, working, and making things in close proximity to each other, sometimes within the same building. And so it's a move away from a 20th century model of single-use zoning where people live in residential areas, commute to office complexes, drive out to shopping malls to buy goods that have been produced from around the world and shipped there. That economy, of course, still exists for many of us, but it is quickly changing, and so a lot of the work I've been doing is looking at the implications of that change. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. I want to think about this Fordism bit for a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. I mean, we're now, what, roughly 100 years from Henry Ford.
Right.
And so we see all kinds, that is our economy, and anybody who thinks about what is facing the United States today, mm-hmm. sees the Ponzi problem that you're raising. And then as I look at the map of the world, I see places that have not yet gone into Henry Fordism. Fordism is still an innovation
in some
compared to what they're doing. There's some highly populated parts of the world. Now I'm wondering, I mean, presumably if everybody has to go through Fordism and see the Ponzi implications of Fordism and then restructure their thinking, we better have about 5 planets in reserve, because right. there's a lot of people
right.
who will need to go through the myths of exploitation and use of non-renewable resources and so forth. How do you think about design for societies that don't have our history?
Right, it's a great question. I mean, I think what we're seeing, certainly in China, is it's going through Fordist and has been in a Fordist mode. And of course, they're encountering the same kinds of problems that we did in the United States. Excess pollution, a lot of environmental damage, increasing social unrest as a result of it, and I think China has recognized, as has the rest of the world, that this is not a sustainable path. However, I don't believe every country has to go through a Fordist phase. I think that, in fact, I find fascinating what's happening in continents such as Africa, where, as you rightly mentioned, they haven't yet reached Fordism. And the idea that is it possible, as I believe it is, to skip the mass production, mass consumption phase of an economy and move directly into a much more flexible, globally connected, networked, on-demand economy. I think one of the things that is fascinating about many parts of the African continent is, however impoverished it may seem materially, a lot of its population is connected globally through smartphones, through the internet. We have colleagues who work in different parts of Africa, and it's always striking that one finds the prevalence of smartphones in even the poorest, seemingly poorest village. And so the idea that mobile digital devices have now become so pervasive around the globe and have enabled people in even relatively remote locations to be connected into this new kind of economy suggests that there's an opportunity to skip the Fordist and maybe even the post-Fordist phase of the 20th century economy and move directly into one that is much more about a sharing, collaborative, on-demand economy. I think as well, one of the things that this new economy can learn from are actually more traditional economies in which sharing and collaboration have always been a part. There is, by some accounts, a return back in this 21st century economy to a kind of community-based local economy in which to share and to collaborate with others suggests the sort of proximity and the ability for people to work in closer proximity to each other, which of course I think is partly why we're seeing people moving back into cities. We're seeing rapid urbanization going on across the globe. And so one of the paradoxes of this new economy is that even though it depends a great deal on mobile digital devices, which suggests that one could live and work essentially anywhere in the world, that people are choosing to live in cities and are moving back into cities at record rates. And I think a lot of that has to do with the nature of this new economy, that it is about networks, it's about collaboration. Many of the emerging on-demand services, from Uber to Lyft on the transportation side, to Airbnb, to food cooperatives, and the list goes on. A lot of these actually work best when people are living in relative density in cities and suburbs. I do, though, also think that there's an argument to be made that this new economy is not only an urban phenomenon. I think there are other aspects of the sharing economy, maybe what Jeremy Rifkin calls the third industrial revolution, that suggests that it also levels the playing fields between cities and smaller communities. One of the ways in which the new economy is sometimes thought of is one in which technologies like 3D printing and CNC fabrication are increasingly dominant modes of production. And when you think that we are at a moment where you can 3D print a working car, it suggests that that can happen anywhere. That can happen in Bemidji as much as in producing cars in the old-fashioned way in places like Detroit. And so I think one of the opportunities of the new economy is for every community, be it in a city, in a suburb, or in a small town, needs to think about what its role in the new sharing economy might be, how in fact it can have a kind of specialized role to play, and how it can utilize its assets, its people, its natural assets, its community assets, its social capital to thrive in the 21st century economy.
I suppose from a small person's point of view, when I grew up with in the 60s was this idea that in America now, whatever you want, as long as you're sort of sane about it, you can have one of eventually. Boats, guns, houses, swimming pools.
Right.
And that, for a lot of the people who went back on the GI Bill, they got it.
Yeah.
That dream was realized.
Right.
And of course, dreams tend to get passed on to your kids.
Right.
What's the dream? What's the replacement dream in the new economy? If the Ponzi scheme, if the dream of whatever I want I can have one of is part of the Ponzi scheme that has to go away and that is going away,
Right.
what kind of a dream? What do I tell my kids
Sure.
to replace the, you could have a boat when you grow up too.
To replace the so-called American dream.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a great question. So just stepping back a moment, one of the arguments for the 20th century consumer economy was that we came out of World War II and essentially devised a way to keep the same pace of production that we had developed during the war. So in war, you produce a lot of stuff and it gets blown up. And so you have to produce more because it gets destroyed, right? And in the post-World War II economy, essentially we had developed such a rate of mass production that we had to convince people that the good life was about owning lots of stuff that our mass production economy was able to produce. Our industrial capacity was enormous, essentially working at wartime levels and incurring lots of debt, environmental debt, all kinds of other debt related to the Ponzi scheme I was just talking about. And so the American dream got defined by how much you owned. Now, to me, what's fascinating about this new economy that's emerging is that it's not necessarily saying that it is there's something wrong with wanting to have, access to a boat, access to a car, access to a house. What I find fascinating about it is it's questioning the idea of ownership. In other words, Airbnb gives you access to all kinds of places. You can rent a palace for the night. You can rent a boat for the time period you use it. You don't have to own it. And so that idea of moving from an ownership economy to an access economy is one in which the so-called American dream, in a curious way, is sustained, but it's done so in a way that is much more environmentally sustainable. In other words, let's take the rise of and the emergence of driverless cars. Uber, for example, and Google are all looking at driverless cars technology. And what is fascinating about that technology, which will be available within a matter of a few years, actually some of it's available now on certain vehicles like the Tesla, is that it will eventually move auto companies from producing cars that we will buy to auto companies that will offer a mobility service contract to people who will have access to cars but won't own them. And so these mobility service contracts will enable any of us to call up a car when we need it to take us to wherever we're going to go. It would presumably be driverless, so it would be a kind of automated taxi service. And it will drive on to the next call, as a taxi cab would. And so think about that. So our entire population is still able to move, but we don't have to store vehicles. Vehicles are now parked over 90% of their time in storage, and we've given over vast amounts of our landscape to vehicle storage. And the auto company's business model has been convincing us to buy new cars because they keep producing new cars off their assembly lines. And when you begin to move from an ownership model to an access model, and from a goods production business model to a service provision business model, you begin to actually expand people's access while having many fewer goods. So, for example, the way in which some people are envisioning the auto industry of the future is that car manufacturers may still make cars, but they will continue to own them, and they will operate them, and they will recycle them, and their business model will be a service model of taking people around. And of course, the most successful companies will offer the best service, the greatest range of options for people. This will dramatically reduce the number of vehicles on the road. It will give manufacturers incentive to design vehicles to be extremely low maintenance because they have to maintain them. It will almost certainly be electric in its propulsion because electric cars are far simpler, much easier to maintain, far less costly to operate. The idea, there's an incentive now for manufacturers to recycle products because they continue to own them. It also relieves us, in the case of vehicles, from having to store all these vehicles. So all of a sudden, vast amounts of our landscape become available for other things. We can build more affordable housing. We can create more eco-services, replace all the wetlands we've taken out of our landscape, provide more habitat for other species. The list of options goes on and on. And also it gives access to many people who are closed out of the ownership economy. So people who do not have the means to own things now have access to things they wouldn't have had otherwise. In the case of automobiles, 1/4 of our population cannot drive. They're children, they're the elderly, they may have a disability of some sort. And so mobility services gives mobility to everybody in our population at about 1/4 of the cost that it now costs us to do so. And so what I find fascinating about this on-demand economy is that it is addressing equity issues, it's addressing environmental issues, it is addressing economic issues, and will, I think, enable us to achieve a relatively high quality of life for a greater number of people without bringing the planet down in the process.
I ran into the on-demand economy last night. I had a bunch of scans of some things my mother had written, and I wanted to transfer them into word processable text. So I began querying the Adobe suites and learned that the tool that would possibly do what I want stopped being sold about 3 years ago and is now rentable, subscribable at what seemed to me a preposterous rate,
Uh-huh.
given that, the whole suite was available at one point for about $700. In fact, I think the one I actually bought was around $300. So now all of these pieces are available
At a price.
at a price,
Right.
and the problem is that since it is the only game in town, there is no regulation. There's no limit to what they can charge for a month of access. Now, perhaps they don't not need to charge exorbitantly if they have a great deal of revenue coming in. Still, is there any way that the new economy, as you're picturing it, is not going to premise a kind of benevolence from the American corporation which has never showed up in the American corporate history?
Right. I mean, it's a great question, and I think it's going to lead us to examine companies like Google, Adobe, and others and think of them as utilities. In other words, we have become so dependent on some of their infrastructure that the economy can't function without them, in the same way that we can't function without an electric utility, the water utility. And so I would predict that for these kinds of essential infrastructures, that they will move into a different economic model, a more regulated utility model rather than a corporate model. On the other hand, the other thing we're seeing is the rise of, it's getting very hard in this new economy to be the only game in town. And so the other aspect of that is the ability for new kinds of app-based offerings that enable people to do things that once used to be controlled by a company are now available at a much lower cost, sometimes free or very low cost. So I think we're going to see, on one hand, some of this become infrastructure that's regulated, and on the other hand, I think we're going to see in the kind of entrepreneurial economy that we are moving into, actually a lot of challenge to large corporate control. I don't think this 21st century economy is going to be particularly kind to large corporations. They are, in the language of my last book, they're very fracture critical. Corporations that are very hierarchical and are very much on a command and control model are kind of misaligned with where the economy is moving right now. And so I think the successful companies will be ones that break their scale down, that operate in a much more nimble way, and in a way that's much more along the lines of information wants to be free rather than in a command and control mode. I think they'll either be regulated or they will be outcompeted.
I remember my first computer. It was an Osborne. It was the size of a sewing machine, did pretty much everything that I want a computer to do now, except it didn't draw pictures.
Right.
When it came out, there were hundreds of people trying to do what it was doing. Companies, that will not even be remembered by history, putting strange combinations of innards together to make something that shined a little brighter. And boy, at that point did one ever feel there's a revolution, power has just been handed back to the people. And, I mean, it was intoxicating. And what seems to have happened is that people just watch. The people with great amounts of money, the corporations and also people flat out, just watched the competition, watched to see what was emerging and then moved in to solidify dominance. And that spirit of competition and excitement and individualization of that period was replaced by the Apple and IBM monoliths.
Mm-hmm.
Then, and Microsoft. Then apps appeared and the same feeling began to permeate. You could get an app to do anything. And anything you thought was expensive, somebody was doing a little differently for free.
Right.
And suddenly, again, the power has come back to me. But I remember that earlier time.
Right.
And I guess that example's in my mind when you speak of the coming of competition and so forth. And even if something like Microsoft is ultimately a dinosaur.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a very big dinosaur.
Yes, absolutely.
and for quite a long time it's going to be able to, file patents across a whole bunch of lines of development, which is the new trick apparently.
Yeah.
So I want to be as hopeful as your picture is, and I'm worried, and I'm wondering if you could say something about the worries.
Well, yeah, I think they are legitimate worries, there's no question. Look at a company like IBM. IBM was a dominant player in the 20th century and, made computers, and it has been moving and has largely moved into a service company. And it's been a company that's been hiring designers at record rates. It may end up with the largest collection of creative innovators of any single company. And I think IBM sees the writing on the wall that, in fact, the value proposition in the new economy is not about making stuff that you hope to sell, but is one about being very flexible in responding to varieties of needs of very different people, in providing sort of mass customized services of one sort or another. Now, that you could still argue that, but IBM is still IBM, it's still a very large corporation. And I think that's true, but on the other hand, I think you're seeing that, I think there may be a different fate for a Google, that Google has become such a key part of the infrastructure that there may be parts of Google that get regulated in the same way that Standard Oil was regulated. There are, if there's players in the economy whose services and products are so essential to the function of the economy, you can't enable them to corner the market and charge whatever they want. So I don't know. I don't have a crystal ball. I don't know where this is all going to play out. But I do have a sense that we're moving and have in many ways already moved from a hierarchical command and control economy to one that is much more about global networks and about access to information and about empowerment. Now, back to the question of what does this mean environmentally? There are those who have been arguing rightly that a lot of this digital technology does not have the best environmental profile. It involves lots of materials that require mining and other kinds of, and has certainly there's the waste stream problem with it. So I think an interesting question is, as we evolve in this 21st century economy, how will we begin to live in ways that are more resilient and environmentally responsible? Because if we don't, the climate change effects are eventually going to catch up with us. They already are starting to. So, and again, I keep coming back to thinking about the physical implications of this. am fascinated by the ways in which people are now choosing to live, and where they're choosing to live, and how they're choosing to live, or not having a choice to live, but would have how they would like to live if they had a choice. And am seeing a kind of misalignment between that and what the economy is still producing. We work a lot in the housing industry, and there is a fairly conservative mindset that still dominates the housing industry, producing a lot of pretty uniform units that are not affordable by many people. And so there's this tendency to overproduce, mass produce, and not provide enough flexibility in what we're making to accommodate the truly diverse needs of people going forward. And so a lot of the mission of my center is to help us figure out what is the 21st century city, what's the 21st century region, and what are the mindset changes that need to occur, what are the regulatory changes and policy changes that need to happen in order for us to stop building the 20th century city, which I see us continuing to do now 15 years into the 21st century. And so part of this is about imagining a different kind of future for ourselves, and one that I think will be better for us as a community and frankly as a species.
Mm-hmm. One aspect of the 21st century city in the next few years anyhow is going to be an aging population. And I'm struck in a city like New York how much the city is tailored to an age.
Yeah.
You know, the elevators to the subway generally don't work, which means if you can't run up and down stairs pretty fast, you're locked out of the cheapest form of public transportation. I mean, just that point leaves. Vienna, on the other hand, has elevators that work.
Right.
A tremendous difference.
Right.
and escalators that aren't out of service.
Right.
But just focusing on this one matter of people moving from having some minor limits, a bad knee, to real frailty, from being conceptual, intellectually agile, to being kind of easily confused.
Right.
From having expansive plans to just trying to get through the day.
Right.
And that's a move that's going to happen for a lot of people, me included, in the next 20 years. Because I watched my mother.
Right.
So how do you think about that piece of the 20th century as it maps onto these other things you're thinking about?
No, it's really true. I think some of the statistics, I think there's some roughly 10,000 people a day retiring, and that's been happening pretty consistently over the last 5 years, and I think it will continue for the next, I think it's 19 years. In other words, just a vast percentage of the American public, in this case talking about the U.S., are reaching and are past retirement age or aging. And I think one of the concerns in the health care industry is the emergence of dementia and Alzheimer's and other forms of cognitive impairment as being a major issue, because modern medicine can actually keep the body relatively healthy. But now we're facing the cognitive impairment issue, for which there is no real cure. And so what will it mean when you have a population where as much as 1/5 of the population has some sort of cognitive impairment? And what is that city? What is that daily existence like? So it's a great question. I think a couple thoughts I have about that. One is that those broken elevators to subway systems will, I think you'll find, be repaired rather quickly. because, in the 20th century economy, in an ownership economy, you were essentially a loser if you had to take the subway. It was like taking the bus. There was something wrong with you, or you were, impoverished. You were poor. Of course, we had an economy that was exploiting people and keeping them poor, and that's a whole other conversation. The 21st century economy, we can't afford poverty anymore. Poverty is too expensive, one. And two, we're going to be finding that increasingly everybody needs a city that works in multiple modes for multiple ages. It isn't a matter that we will be sorted so much by economic status as we will increasingly by age. And everybody, of course, will eventually age. And so the interest in having an age-friendly city, a city where universal design principles work, will have a much greater cohort of support than those subways did in New York in the 20th century. So I think there's going to be a shift in the way we think about the ability of people to move around cities to get their daily needs met. Of course, I think one of the other interesting aspects of the driverless or autonomous vehicle phenomenon is the notion that we may need to move around less. I think this is also a characteristic of this new economy, that we will increasingly move bytes rather than bodies, and that we will see, for example, food being delivered as we now see it, being delivered to you rather than you having to go buy food at a grocery store. A lot of the expense of that comes from the fact that you have to pay a driver. Well, when a lot of that gets automated, it becomes much less expensive. One of the first applications of mobility services will actually be in long-distance trucking. Long-distance trucks have gotten so big in order to afford the driver. You take the driver out of the picture and the business model changes completely. Trucking changes by its nature. And so we're going to start to see new kinds of retailing services available. One of the things that we're looking at is the idea of retailing moving out of traditional bricks and mortar stores and being mobile, so that we now know that people in certain neighborhoods tend to buy certain kinds of goods. You could have those goods available on minivans and in micro trucks moving around the city as they're called up and then delivered to you, so that you could actually get goods delivered to you as fast as if you drove to the store, bought them, and drove home. And so we will start to see mobility changing the way in which we go about our daily lives. So some of the transportation and mobility barriers that you were talking about will change, and some of them will become moot.
I was struck by one aspect of this issue just this weekend. I went to visit my mother, who has recently had some changes in her balance. She walks less well.
Right.
And suddenly the house that she needs is somewhat different than the house she lives in. I mean, she never worried before this week about the fact that too many tables have corners.
Right.
Now, that is a problem.
Yes.
And so, and of course it's a standard thing, the person with the large house needing to move into something smaller, but then there's going to be the situation of the person in the something smaller needing something different, and the next week really needing something quite different.
Right.
And so I'm wondering if we just sort of think about housing for a minute.
Right. Well, that's a great question, and absolutely, again, what I find fascinating is this idea that as we move from an ownership economy to an access economy, your mother might not actually own that furniture, right? And that furniture might get substituted with more appropriate furniture as she ages. In other words, instead of saying, I'm stuck with this dining room table with corners and I'm worried about the corners, is that there may be very little of it that she owns, and she could call up her furniture supplier and say, time to take out the old furniture, it's no longer appropriate for my conditions, I need the table with the rounded corners and the soft edges. And so I know this sounds strange in our world today because we still have a model in mind that is based on, this is my stuff, I own this. But what I find fascinating, particularly about the millennial generation, is this recognition that ownership is a liability as much as an asset, and that you are stuck with things that actually impede your ability to change, to move, to age, whatever the issue is. And as that mindset begins to take hold throughout the larger economy, it's raising questions about, well, just how much stuff do I really want to own? How much do I really need? And can I, in fact, live an existence in which I have flexibility and diversity of access? For example, I think on housing, the rise of apartments, rental apartments, again, is really extraordinary, the numbers of apartments that are being built. Now, in Minnesota, there's a particular reason driving some of that because of laws related to the building of condos. But nevertheless, I think we're seeing a emergence of a population that's saying, instead of owning this house that I might get stuck with, or it might go underwater and I can't move, I would rather rent, because renting gives me the opportunity to make changes as my situations changes. And so that, I think, is this shift that's happening in this kind of post-Fordist economy that we're in.
I'm reminded of a sort of an idiom. You know, we talk about the House of Habsburg, the House of Wittgenstein, the House of Warburg, the great enterprises that span centuries or are built as houses.
Right.
And the sense is, if one inhabits a house that's, say, 300 years old, that the house is carrying history. And, you know, it may be inappropriate, somewhat inappropriate for infants and somewhat inappropriate for young people, but it's sort of, you live through something that endures. Now, I'm wondering, in the city you're imagining, where so much can change, where so many things that were assumed and rigid are now a matter of calling the supplier and saying, I need a different kind of thing here. What carries the memory? What carries the tradition? What carries, as it were, the motivation forward from the past? Mm-hmm. In the way that, for example, Schönbrunn carried for every Habsburg who walked through its corridors and walked through its gardens, a sense of how to be the emperor.
Yeah. Well, it's, again, another great question. I think to step way back, I think it is useful to remember that for over 90% of the history of our species, we were nomadic, right? We lived in small tribal groups, we moved around, and we lived pretty lightly on the land because basically we lived with what we could carry. For 5,000, 6,000, maybe let's say 10,000 years or so, we've become more sedentary, more agricultural in our base, and built cities, made stuff, owned stuff, and attached meaning to the places and the stuff that we owned. But if you look across the history of our species, this is an aberration for our species. Our species, we did not evolve as a species to live this way. And what I find fascinating about the world that I think we're entering is that it links back to a deep resonance with how we evolved to live, which was essentially nomadic. To me, the power of mobile digital devices is really their ability to essentially put the world in the palm of our hands. When I ask my students, would you rather have a car or a smartphone? Almost all of them would rather have a smartphone. And as one student said recently, her smartphone is her transportation. In other words, she recognizes she can get any transportation she wants from her smartphone. She doesn't need a car. And so the part of the power of mobile digital devices as opposed to computers. See, I think that the computer was a necessary but not sufficient technology for the new economy. It is necessary because it's the digital base of the new economy, but it's the mobility issue that has been transformative. And the ability for us to say, we don't need to sort of have stuff to remember. So to answer your question about how do we remember, what is the cultural memory that we have, I would argue that we've always had that ability. In nomadic cultures, it was about storytelling. It was about myths. It was a verbal and aesthetic way of remembering the past. It was mythic. It had many of those characteristics that you carried with you. It wasn't necessarily stuff. It wasn't the heavy heirloom piece of furniture and the library full of books. And my hunch is that we are heading back into a very different kind of world, one that is closer to the way we evolved than the way we've been living.
I'm just amused because we're sort of in the basement, but we're in the basement of an architecture school.
Yes.
And I always sort of thought in a naive way that an architecture school was about, it's like close associates, architecture that endures.
Right.
Is the theme.
Right.
And I always thought, well, it better endure. I don't want it to melt.
Right.
But
yeah.
On the other hand, it sounds like you're advertising from the basement for architecture that melts.
Yes. Well, that's a good question. There's no question that the way we conceive of architecture has really been aligned with the emergence of human settlements, permanent human settlements, and building big permanent structures, right? And I don't know if it's a matter that we will essentially go back to a nomadic tradition where everything we need will be carried with us. I do think there's still a role for more permanent structures, but the ways in which we inhabit them may be much more flexible and able to change in ways that we don't think of right now. The office outside my door here, every piece of furniture you see is on casters. Everything can move. This entire office could, within literally a matter of about 10 minutes, disappear. There's still a big concrete structure supporting all of it, but this suggests that this space out here could be something entirely different in another half hour. It could be something, a completely different function, organized in a completely different way. And that's where I see architecture going, is that it will have, the parts of it that are permanent are going to be designed in ways that are much more flexible and accommodating of a much wider range of uses. And then the things that are not permanent are going to be much lighter, much more mobile, much more easily moved in and moved out, and maybe we won't even own it. It'll just be, everything would be on rent or on loan or shared, and will change relatively rapidly. So I think it doesn't mean architecture will go away, but it does suggest a different way to think about it.
Thank you.